So how are they going to hack our election? Dennis?
Thank you. Okay, here's what we're going to do, everybody. Thank you. We have a lot of questions. We have many questions from the internet. We have other questions that are coming into us also via text message. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read off 2 questions at a time. And the way we'll handle this, we have approximately an hour in the room. We'll start first with Barbara, then to Bill and Ray, then second time with Bill, then Ray, and then Barbara, etc. So I just want to see. It doesn't mean everybody has to answer each question. It just means that I want to make sure we move this along so that we actually get as many of these in as we can. All right, so there we have a question. This one is from, I'm not going to say who he is, but someone who worked at the Iran desk of the National Security Council during the 1970s. He asked this. He said, you recently released a memo stating that the claims made by United States intelligence and passed on to President Trump that Iran is the principal sponsor of terrorism is a lie. You also said that the claim also from U.S. intel and the British and Israelis that Iran continues to have a nuclear weapons development program is also a lie. Could you speak on this and how the president is being misled in a way that increases the danger of war? Okay, so that's the first question. And again, I'll start in the way I said, but I obviously that's mainly directed to the VIP's representatives. There's a second question, and this question is, I want to try to take these in order. Well, this one is from actually for Ray McGovern, but we'll says, I remember you once said, do you know why the sun never sets on the British Empire? That's because the good Lord does not trust them in the dark. The situation is, okay, if you remember back on September 15th, 2008, U.S. Congress voted no on the bailouts. Over the next 48 hours, panic set in. For an empire in which the sun never sets, the British were going through a solar eclipse at that time. Financially, I suppose that means a particular weakness we shall bear in mind. So those are 2 things that we've gotten in. Let me just ask Barbara first. She may have a comment on what she's heard. I think that we should probably go with that, or if you have any response to the 2 questions, and then we'll go to Bill and then to Ray, if that's okay. All right, Barbara?
Yeah, I don't have any real response on the Iran question. I think that really is up to the VIPs in terms of their memo. That's what's specifically being asked about. With respect to the British Empire, I think that Bill's actual discussion of his intellectual superiority to them is relevant, but it doesn't mean that it's not controlling, that, you know, a great deal of how we think and how we operate and everything else among the people who are running the world at this point is rooted in precisely the British imperial policy and remains so. So that's the comment I would have on that. Obviously, he's smarter than they are.
I was just making a technical comment. Technically, I was speaking.
Well, it is impossible to understand U.S. policy toward Iran or Iraq or Syria without realizing the inordinate influence that Israel has on our policymakers and our policy planning. The whole Syria thing can be explained by us wanting to do Israel's bidding to make sure that Bashar al-Assad either falls or that there's such chaos in Syria that no one can resupply Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And the British have said so, if you look closely, even in the New York Times. So this canard about the Iranians developing a nuclear weapon was very alive until 2007, when an honest national intelligence estimate manager commissioned and conducted a NIE, National Intelligence Estimate, on Iran's nuclear capability, and surprised everyone, including Bush and Cheney, who had been saying 2 weeks before the release of the NIE that Iran was just about to get a nuclear weapon. They're just right on the verge. The estimate in November of 2007 said, and I quote, Iran stopped working on a nuclear weapon at the end of 2003 and has not resumed work on a nuclear weapon. That has been the case, and that has been attested to by every national intelligence director in the years since, okay? Now, you'd never know that from reading the New York Times, right? And so what are we doing now? The UN inspectors have said that Iran is complying with the Iran deal, with the nuclear deal. So it's all artificially stoked up. And these riots in Tehran are being exploited. They have a terrible flashback effect on my memory. Back in 1953, that's when we overthrew the duly elected democratic government of Mossadegh. So in terms of what Trump has in mind, whatever his son-in-law whispers in his ear or some sheikh in Saudi Arabia says he should do, I mean, this is really dangerous stuff, but there is no threat from Iran to us, and we can prove, and did prove conclusively, that it is not correct to say that Iran is the most ardent supporter of terrorism in the world. That bouquet goes to the United States of America, as Martin Luther King said back many decades ago.
Something I could add. Let me add something here. Yeah, that's not to say that the Iranians aren't doing something. They are. Kirk Wiebe and I had a subcontract with Customs and Border Protection. So, and when we were down there, we were looking at all the data, imports, exports, and things like that, and we found that the Iranians had located about 5,032 businesses in Dubai, in the Arab Emirates, because it's outside Iran and therefore outside the restriction on trade. And we found from a BIS tip, Bureau of Industrial Security from Department of Commerce, that there were certain companies involved in transfer of materials for IEDs in Afghanistan and Iraq. And those companies were Iranian, and we found them all in Dubai. So then we thought, well, gee, that we went in, looked using Google again, went on the web, and we found all this information about them that BIS didn't even know about. So we thought we'd share that with them, and we did. And basically what it was we found the key to finding companies trying to smuggle weapons, drugs, all kinds of material in and out inside the containers, in the boxes inside the container. So that we then had the capability of telling Customs and Border Protection what containers to open, what box to look into in that container. So you could find out who was doing what and find all the bad stuff, drugs, anything you want. And so we said we could do this for your entire data set. You only had like 500 million items. That was pretty simple for us, okay? It's a very small data set for us anyway. And so we could do that, and for the first run we could probably produce maybe 40,000 targets you need to look at, companies' names of companies that are doing bad things. So we could get that in the first run. And we could do it with Kirk Wiebe and I and two programmers. We can make that, fix your database, correct it and all that, because everybody's reporting things to them from different languages using English, and it's not their first language, so they make mistakes. We were able to correct all of that too. And they refused to do that, mainly because they claimed they only had 2 analysts, but you had all these inspectors at every port of entry. All you'd have to do is distribute that data to all those thousands of inspectors at all these ports of entry, and they could find it. You didn't have to have people analyze it. The program would do it for them. So, but they refused to do that. One of the reasons I thought they would do that is because we could also pick out drug smuggling by CIA or FBI doing funny things like, all that giving guns to the drug cartels, things like that. We could detect all of that kind of crap. And so they didn't want us doing that. And so they refused to make that happen. But, Iran is doing some things, and we could have picked out all that. In fact, the first run, we went and downloaded one site that listed 5,032, roughly, companies, Iranian-based companies in Dubai. we ran the program through that and found 222 names of companies that were subgrouped into 55 subgroups of activity. And we knew 2 groups of those were involved in the IEDs, and we figured the others were part of smuggling, attempts to get nuclear materials or nuclear-related, trying to work on triggering devices, things like that, plus smuggling weapons and all kinds of things like that. And we said, here's the 55 groups of targets you have. All you have to do is tell your inspectors anytime something comes through in any container with any box from them, go look at it. They refused to do that too. Instead, they let a $1.2 billion contract to IBM to do their database.
Okay, now we also can take questions from here. We have a question here. Let's take this one first, and then we'll go to you. Okay, go ahead. Go right to your microphone. Yeah. Just say your first name at least, so we just know.
Sure. My name is Anna. Thank you so much for organizing this. It's wonderful, interesting. I'm from Georgia, Republic of Georgia, and we had a short 1-week war with Russia in 2008, and it was quite scary. And I want to hear your opinion or knowledge or what happened there, because most of us Georgians don't really know what happened. A lot of us saw it as like an attempt to start another third world war. It is quite unpatriotic right now in Georgia to believe that we, Georgian side, and Saakashvili somehow kind of provoked Russia to start this whole thing. There's a lot of different ideas of what happened back then, but the population really doesn't know. So I just wonder, from your intelligence perspective, if you have any idea. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, that was really a curious set of circumstances. We're talking August 2008. In April 2008, NATO, at a summit in Bucharest, decided Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO. Now, I don't know who told Saakashvili that meant he could give the Russians a bloody nose and escape the consequences, but you had people like Condoleezza Rice and all those other people around, so they probably did. So he went off half-cocked and started shooting up a bunch of villages, and then Russian troops were actually affected. And the Russians didn't they looked askance at that, let's put it that way. They came through the tunnel and they obliterated those Georgian forces that were shooting at them. Now, the common wisdom here in this country is that Russia tried to invade Georgia. That's as much a crock as Russia invading Ukraine, okay? Russia didn't invade Crimea. They were already there under a bilateral understanding. And in the east, sure, they sent weapons and some soldiers there, but the Russians invading these. This was sort of looked on as a net gain in the White House because it gave the Russians a bloody nose, and most of the people in the world believe that the Russians invaded Georgia, and it was not that way. It was provoked by Saakashvili, and if you followed that character around now, you know what kind of guy he is, flitting around the Ukraine and in prison and not in prison, and he just, that's the kind of guy that the Bush regime liked to deal with, and he was not very well under control.
Well, I would say basically I've experienced Russian invasions, and from the intelligence perspective, several of them, and none of the Ukraine or Georgia stuff ever looked like any of the invasions. They didn't back it up with anything, okay? So it wasn't really an invasion. But I also looked at those things happened without and surprised our people in government. That meant that they lost all the knowledge and everything I left them when I left there in 2001. They no longer have the 5 warning indicators. They no longer understand how to do that with the Russians. To me, I could read them like the back of my hand. I mean, I had a better source of information for warning down at the lowest levels of command. That was the East German Army, right? That was very clear. I knew everything they did. Anytime they did anything, I knew exactly that it was right to schedule, right to the plan and everything. If they did the wrong thing, I knew it. And that's why that was one of my indicators for the Polish crisis, and when it was coming up 80, 81, that period of time. So that was my look at the lowest level. The highest level had my five warning indicators. So, I had used the lowest and highest to figure out what was going on. And it was very clear to me that they were getting ready to do something there in Poland. So, but it didn't happen because they declared martial law in April 3rd, I think it was, or something like that. But at any rate, what it said to me, and the movement of troops, Russian troops, more troops into Crimea, they were already there because they had the Black Sea Fleet headquarters was there at the Sevastopol, and it was a major facility for them, so they weren't going to let that go. So, but they should have picked up on it because any movement like that would have been obvious to me, or for example, movement of materials or troops into the area of eastern Ukraine. That would have been obvious too, and that was missed. So it just tells me our intelligence community has really lost it.
Bill, have you thought of selling your copyright to the indicators that you left behind? Seems to me we need them.
When I first came up with those things, all the people said we have to keep them secret. We can't let anybody know. I told them, I said, hell, I can go to the Russian embassy in Washington and tell them what that is, and they can't do a damn thing about it, because it's all built into their doctrine. If they want to change their doctrine, okay, but they can't really do that. So, but anyway, you had to know how to do it. That's all, and they didn't understand it.
Okay, we're going back to questions again. These are again from internet. This is from Thomas. How do we bring courage to the American citizens to dump the U.S.-UK James Bond special relationship, Cold War mentality, and at the same time cooperate with Russia and China? This should not be a time to panic, but a time for optimism. Okay, that's what he has to say. Then there is a next question. If I can get here. It's a little hard to read. It's handwritten, so give me a minute. All right. This is from Houston, and this is mainly directed to Mr. Binney and McGovern. How do you propose we reform the NSA, CIA, FBI, and other defense intelligence agencies in our government? I'll take that section. There's another two sections to the question, but I'm going to right now omit those. And I'm going to ask Barbara if you have any response to the first question or what you've heard on the Georgia issue.
I think the Georgia issue is basically grounded also. The factor which isn't mentioned is that both Georgia and Ukraine represented a very explicit going back on the specific agreement recently released with James Baker that none of these countries in the former Soviet bloc were going to be asked to join NATO. And that obviously had to be responded to from Putin's standpoint. But I think in terms of the question about spreading optimism, what China is actually doing in the developing sector at this point is basis for optimism throughout the world. It really is a new paradigm of thinking. If you think about it, all of the geopolitical stuff, which is represented by the Anglo-American relationship, by this notion of zero-sum games, that's all overthrown once whole countries in the world start talking about let's eradicate poverty in the next 10 years, and let's respect each other's social systems while we're doing so. Let's actually organize around the common aims of mankind. What was done in Syria is a good example of what can happen to terrorism if the Russians and, in some sense, the United States can find a way to actually cooperate. I think on the local level in the United States, in so-called flyover country like West Virginia, not the two coasts, the country which actually voted for Donald Trump in the last election, the people who used to represent a producing society in the United States, would welcome, if they knew about it, the approach towards building large infrastructure, the approach of having the government through some form of development bank or what have you actually fund that, the approach of once again thinking like Americans in big ways, going to space, exploring the frontiers of science, all of the things which we have sort of stopped thinking about. And I think this represents a fundamental challenge to our present kind of depressed, pessimistic thinking if we actually start looking at, as I said, the idea that China says we're going to get rid of poverty in China within 7 years, and we're going to dedicate the entire society to doing that. That's something which was said at the last Party Congress. It's something which we used to talk about here to some extent, but it's not a thought which has crossed the American terrain in a very, very long time. So this is exciting. I mean, you've got Africa, which God knows for entire centuries has been left completely undeveloped. And now you got rail lines actually connecting the country rather than taking resources out of it. You've got a whole dedication to the idea that you're going to build whole new cities, whole new infrastructure on a modern platform. All of that's very exciting, and it's optimistic. So I think that that's the basis upon which we can actually, start to turn this thing around, provided people know about it and they start to contribute in the same way that Chinese society is right now contributing towards realizing that type of economic development program for this country. And that's what's really lacking. We're still under the Wall Street regime. We're still not recovered from 2008. We're still in a situation in which most of our population has to really try and scratch for thinking about what the purpose of life is all about. And that's what we have to change.
For the U.S. government, I think we have to change the underlying cultures involved in our organizations, the agencies involved. My original suggestion was give me 3 regiments of samurai one night and we can finish the job. But it was like, but that was a little blood shed. But it'll all be over one night. So it's like 9,000 swords swishing all around. So, at any rate. But so the point is that we have a culture that is grown up to be warmongering. I mean, they're basically sending our young people off to kill or be killed, and we're not taking care of them when they come back. All kinds of problems and all kinds of expenditures of lives and money and resources on things that don't solve anything. I mean, we went into Libya. What is the result of Libya? We went into Syria. What's the result there? It's still a mess. Look at Iraq. That's still a mess. And we kept. The total cost of war was something like somewhere in the range of $5 to $9 trillion. Now that's all in the debt, and we're going to have to pay that. I mean, we own our children's will. But one of the things I'd said at the time when they were talking about asking Ukraine to join the NATO, I was suggesting, well, if you're going to do that, why don't you ask Russia too? Because if you don't, I mean, what you're doing is building alliances that making them look like an adversary or a threat. And so, but if you are inclusive of them, they won't act like a threat. I thought that was a good way to approach it, but it takes a total mind change of these warmongers. That's really what's at the heart here. That whole mindset has to change. And a lot of people are getting hurt because of this. I mean, look at the Tonkin Gulf here, an event that didn't happen. Even the captain of the ship told the people in our administration at the time, LBJs, that attack did not happen. This is the captain of the ship that was supposedly attacked. And yet they said it did, and they used it as a pretext to go kill a couple million people in Indochina. And then look at weapons of mass destruction. This is the warmongering attitude of these people have. And look at McCain and all these people down in the Senate and House saying, warmongers saying this is an act of war. Let's go shoot the Russian planes down in Syria. Declare a no-fly zone. Anybody goes in, we'll shoot them down. That's the arrogance of power, right? And warmongering. That mentality has to change. And the way I would suggest is send their kids to fight the war.
Nothing will change as long as the U.S. Pretends to be the sole indispensable country of the world. It's no longer the sole indispensable country of the world, but it doesn't realize that yet. The hope is that it will come to realize that, and that it will back down peaceably rather than start more wars. Gilbert Doctorow has a wonderful book out. It's called "Does the U.S. Have a Future?" He grapples with all these issues and with specific respect to Russia and how Russia and the U.S. really need to get along and learn to get along together. The question about is there a prospect or any hope for reform in the intelligence community? Well, you know, the die is cast right now. If, and I will be surprised if this happens, if Congress and the Senate have the guts to assert their constitutional prerogative to oversee these agencies, given the blatant disregard for law on the part of the FBI, CIA, NSA, and a couple other places, if they face into that, there's going to be a battle royale. I don't know how it will come out. I fear that the deep state will win yet once again. But I have hope that they'll be joined, and that with the evidence from those emails now from those FBI high-level officials, that people will start investigating this and say, look, it's as bad as it was in the 70s when the Church Committee was looking at these things. Let's call a halt to it and hold people accountable if they lied, hold people accountable if they did sedition, because that's pretty much what it's amounting to in some of these areas.
Okay, great. Okay, good. We'll take another question here, from the microphone. Go ahead.
Yes, hi. My name is Alvin, and it's always great to get real intelligence from real analysts and experts, and it's very patriotic of you both, so thank you. And I'm going to direct the question to Barbara, though, because in everything that's been laid out, all the scenarios, all the lies that both Bill and Ray have gone through, and you have, of course, written a report about this. You referenced early on, you brought the question up as to why, and then went into that it's the Anglo-Dutch-British system that is desperate to keep itself afloat at the expense of literally billions of other people. And that system is primarily a monetary system. In 2007, Mr. LaRouche was very clear in his forecast that the system is hopelessly failed and bankrupt, cannot be saved, and only a complete and fundamental shift in the system can restore order to first the United States, but of course it's a global system. So that this becomes the forefront and the fight, and there's nothing more British than the monetary system. So all the reports and all the intelligence and all the attacks against Trump are primarily for two reasons. One, his potential to work with Russia and China, who of course are emerging economies, and you've talked about the new paradigm. And the other, of course, is while he's yet to act on it, and this is where our new report comes in on the 4 laws of LaRouche, to institute Glass-Steagall and follow the lead of the Chinese in rebuilding the world. But there is this British bloc that people have. Now, this is understandable, I suppose, but I'd like, on this why question, Barbara, why is it that we should not tolerate this from our leaders and our people that we're trying to organize, avoiding the British question here that controls Mueller, the Clappers, and the Brennans of the world?
Well, we really can't live with this system anymore. That's what you have to really understand. We're on the verge of yet another financial collapse. Worse than 2008. What these guys have done is go out and repeat exactly the same exercise as they did in 2008, and it's sucking the life out of the entire economy. Wall Street is obviously not a measurement for what happens in the economy. You've got, entire sections of our country which are actually, dying needless deaths from opium and suicide and lack of a purpose. And so we really don't, you could put a clock on your desk if you need some notion of necessity and say, how many people died of suicide today in the United States of America? How many people died of opium deaths today in the United States of America? What's that clock saying in terms of where our society is actually going? Everybody who's all involved in this crazy, stuff around the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, everything else that goes on as really a kind of a kabuki show in Washington, D.C., is completely out of touch with that reality. What is happening to this country? What is happening to the children of this country? What kind of life are you actually saying you're going to guarantee them? It used to be that we had some claim to being a necessary nation in the world. That claim is disappearing because Wall Street would have it that they're essential, the rest of us are not. It's really as simple as that. So we don't have a choice. You can continue to have entire cities like Houston or an island like Puerto Rico wiped out by nature because we forgot how to actually build infrastructure or engineer things in this country. You can have, needless deaths all over the world in terms of wars, which we keep getting involved in for somebody else's idea of security on the planet. But the point is that the issue right now is that there's a new emergent paradigm coming into being in the world. What the British will tell you and what their allies in the United States will tell you is that can't come into existence. You can't have a rising power, without war. Well, in history, basically there have been times when human beings have managed to be human beings. There's the great Treaty of Westphalia, for example, which ended the religious carnage of the horrible Middle Ages and the Black Death and everything else. And the notion of that was very similar to what China is now expressing in the new paradigm. I will act on the basis of the advantage of the other. That principle in terms of that's what it means to be a human being. Zero-sum games, geopolitics, all of this other stuff which has more or less been imposed on us in the 20th century and the bad century, if you will, and the 21st century in terms of thinking about what it means to be a human being has to be really tossed aside at this point if we're going to say we have the moral fitness to survive. Do we have the moral fitness to survive? That's really the question. And, I think that what's represented here by what we call the 4 laws and everything else is not now just kind of a program which one advocates. It is pure necessity in terms of whether or not this nation is going to survive economically or not. And that's reality. Most of the rest of this stuff is really some kind of alien invasion of some form of, I guess they would call it entertainment, which we're supposed to engage in while the world whittles away. But that's the necessity.
Anything else? Thanks. Okay, so let's see. We have several. We're going to try to do 3 questions now from the internet and from text, and we'll go to another question from the microphone if somebody has one. It's also 9:16, so we're going to have about another 20 minutes of this. All right, so Steve on the internet says, in their article for Consortium News, More Holes in the Russiagate Narrative, Binney and McGovern list several data transfer rates they have obtained experimentally and compare these to the higher rate of 22.7 megabytes per second reflected in the Guccifer incident. But I understand the latter to be the average rate over the whole transfer. Can Mr. Binney confirm and clarify whether the transfer rates they have obtained experimentally apply specifically to peak rates rather than average rates? Can he elaborate on that distinction? So I'm going to leave it at that. That's that one. Then there's a second question which I have, which is written out, and this one is goes back to Iran. Most Iranians believe that the CIA, the British intelligence and CIA, are behind the 1979 Iranian revolution to give power to the Ayatollahs, preventing communism spreading down to the Middle East. I would like to hear your opinion about that. Second part of that was, what was the role of Israel, the CIA, and the British behind the Iran-Iraq war? I guess that's the war from 1980 to 88. And then let me see if I can get a third question in here. This one is from Houston. I'm going to try to read this. Okay, this is basically about. Well, actually, let me say this. It's about whether there were developments around. What is the situation about the death of DNC worker Seth Rich? Because you referenced it, and there was something about Assange having offered $20,000 for information on the killer. So those are three questions that have come in, and I guess maybe we should start with the first one about the rates with you, Bill.
Yeah, they were pretty fast. He's right. 22.7 is the average over the 87 seconds of transfer. The transfer was just slightly under 16 gigabits for 82 seconds, 87 seconds. So if you divide that out, that turned out to be the average, the transfer. But at certain points along, we got high points, and the highest point we found one at 38 point something megabytes per second. But the highest one we found overall of the entire transfer was 49.1 megabytes per second. Okay. Well, Seth Rich, I think. Well, it goes back to the illicit recording of Cy Hirsch's conversation about Seth Rich and what the FBI knows about that. In other words, he was saying that he had a source in the FBI that was reading this report about Seth Rich and said that the FBI had possession of Seth Rich's computer and that his computer showed contacts with WikiLeaks, and that he was asking for, and he was providing some samples of emails to them, and also asking for money for the rest of them. So there was a contact. The FBI says that they, in their report, that they had this in his computer, which meant, of course, to me, that NSA, who's watching WikiLeaks Cast Iron, would know about that contact too. They in turn would do what's called a series check for reporting, and then issue a report on that, and mask or conceal the identity of the U.S. person in that, meaning Seth Rich. So that means that anybody wanting to know who is involved in offering emails to WikiLeaks for money, especially democratic emails like the Podesta or the DNC emails, they would have to request unmasking of that name, and they'd have to do that with NSA. And so NSA would have a record of who did that. And so that would certainly be a factor in the murder of Seth Rich.
So the question really is, why doesn't the president or the celebrated General Kelly go over to the NSA and ask them for whatever records they have on this? Why don't they act like a White House? What are they afraid of? Well, it's really hard to know. My best guess is the deep state. Why is it that as soon as you mention Seth Rich, everybody says, conspiracy theorists, conspiracy theorists, conspiracy theorists? You know, the term conspiracy theorist was invented by a fellow named Alan Dulles. And you know what it pertained to? You're right. Yeah, the Warren Report. Anybody who took any issue with the school solution or the conventional wisdom about who killed John Kennedy was ipso facto a conspiracy theorist, okay? So there's something really fishy going on here, and the FBI knows chapter and verse because they got the computer. They're supposed to be investigating it. NSA, as Bill has just said, would know a whole lot. Okay, so what's with this kabuki dance? Why can't the president Why can't the head of the NSA and CIA find out the answers to these things? The only answer that I can come to is that they're afraid. They're afraid of the deep state. Now, you know, Senator Schumer, who I think some of you know, was on Rachel Maddow on the 3rd of January last year. And he said, you know, Rachel, Trump, I thought he was a smart guy, but he's does something very foolish. She said, oh, what's that, Chuck? I said, well, he's taken on the intelligence community. And they have 6 ways from Sunday to get back at you. I thought he's a smart businessman, but he's done something really dumb. So Rachel, always ready for the next question, said, are you saying, Senator Schumer, that the President of the United States should be afraid of the CIA? She didn't say that, did she? What did she say? Well, let's go to break. Okay? Now, what other inference do you get from that? Here's Schumer, 30 years in the House, 30 years in the Senate? Something like that, anyway. He's 100 years old. He knows Washington, and he's saying the President of the United States should be afraid of the CIA. Now, there are a lot of things that Trump has not done that he should do. One clever thing he did, and this is very, very appropriate here because Bill's sitting right next to me. I'm sort of a slow analyst, okay? I'm an all-source analyst, so I can never figure. I'm sort of like a perceiver on the Myers-Briggs, you know? I try to put it all together. And I figured, you know, why would the president direct the head of the CIA to invite Bill Binney in for an hour to talk about what Binney thinks about the so-called Russian hack? I couldn't figure that out until like last night. I said, you know, I think I've got it. And I checked it out with Bill on the train coming up, and he says, well, yeah, Ray, I mean, you just come into that, okay? And the answer is that the only salvation that the CIA technocrats, the cyber weapons guys have, is if they could manufacture things like yellow cake or aluminum tubes or something like that and make it appear that Russia hacked into the election, okay? They can't do that now. You know why? Because they know that the director talks to Bill Binney, and Bill will shoot him right down. And so the way I reason it, and Bill kind of agrees, I think, is that the president said, you know, I'm afraid those CIA nicks are going to come up with, quote, proof, end quote, that the Russians hacked and that I was involved and all that kind of stuff. What better way to preempt that than to tell the head of the CIA to talk to the guy who knows how these things work and kind of warn all those guys in the trenches that they can't fool around because Binney's going to blow the whistle on them if they try to fool around with things like yellow cake. Yellow cake, of course, is the, you know, the uranium that this got from deepest, darkest Africa.
Also, it came out in the Good American, the movie about me. I said I have a really, or people have said that about me, I have a really good bullshit detector. So that, you know, I know when these people are lying. Okay, I knew it from the beginning. So, but he also did ask, what is your relationship with the FBI? And I said, well, the last time I saw them, they were pointing guns at me. So, I mean, this is what I told him anyway. I didn't mix words, you know, and he said, well, would you be amenable to talk to the NSA and the FBI? I said, sure, but I wouldn't participate in their violation of the constitutional rights of every citizen in the United States. He said, well, nobody wants that. Well, I mean, come on, you know? He was on the Intelligence Committee, right? So he knows, or he at least has some idea. Maybe he doesn't know exactly, but I know exactly from all these diagrams. I know what everything does because it's the same damn thing I left these people when I left NSA. So I know everything that's going on there. So, at any rate, that's what he suggested I do for him, and he said he would set it up and call me. Well, I'm still waiting for the call. But I thought it would be a real hoot going back to NSA and going into FBI saying, what do you got on this? And let me see it, and I don't want any bullshit from you.
Yeah, let me just ask for some audience participation here. What do you think Bill should do now? I mean, it's been October 24th. Bill was instructed to talk to the head of the NSA and the head of the FBI, and nothing's happened. So, what do you think he should do? Anyone? Should just shout it out. Tweet the president. Ain't that tweet?
Donald Trump should make you the head of the NSA. Head of the roll, you know?
I just know too many of those people. They're all criminals anyway.
Okay. We're coming up to the end. So microphone again. We'll do one more round there.
Good evening. I'm so privileged to be speaking with you, Mr. McGovern and Mr. Binney. My name is Susan Olson. I'm a registered nurse and a professional singer and was living the average suburban life on Long Island. I'm a friend of Karen Stewart, NSA whistleblower. I'm a recent founder of a new group called Targeted Justice. And what I'd like to ask for you, I was a registered nurse working here in New York City. And I'm sorry, but my heart is being raced right now, not of my own control. I was an EEOC whistleblower and abided by the rules. And like you said, we need people to stand up for the Constitution, stand up for our rights. We cannot allow the deep state to run the medical community, the educational community, and everything else that you're discussing. I followed the book. I unfortunately started Googling and realizing that I was dealing now with the deep state. After my 8th cell phone was hacked, my iCloud was hacked, 3 Mac computers were hacked, I realized I was dealing with something else, and this doctor that I had crossed paths with was more than likely connected to this deep state. I recently have conclusive proof that after undergoing a minor procedure, I was non-consensually implanted with a medical body area network and a brain chip. My functions are completely controlled, and we have tracked down the satellites that are being directed to me. When I found this information out, they triggered ventricular tachycardia, sent me to the emergency room where they promptly handcuffed me in front of my children, stripped me, and carted me off to a psychiatric hospital. I was told that I was paranoid delusional, get out of my head that there's anybody involved with hacking my computers. I told them to Google Weeping Angel, which we know Julian Assange released, and I do have 3 smart TVs in my home. They refused to Google targeting. They refused to Google directed energy weapons. They refused to Google anything about this. I have been physically attacked for 2 years. If I am just a suburban mom, and I think what you're talking about after talking with whistleblowers like Karen Stewart, who I thank God I met early in my targeting, whistleblower Richard Lighthouse, a former NASA engineer who's being targeted. What advice are you going to give to people? We need to band together, and I really think it's going to be more than experts. You're going to have to get people of the United States. This has to be made known public. And if the cabal owns the major media, how do we do this and then protect the people that stand up for the Constitution?
You know, of course, Kirk Wiebe and I are involved in a study on yeah, right.
It out, but it might have been hacked.
Well, yeah, but see, the point is, every time you try to assert things like that, people say you're mentally disturbed of one form or another. So our point with this study is we wanted to force people down this path, scientific path, that says, here are the symptoms. We collect symptoms and compile them and see consistencies in symptoms. Then take documentation on known techniques that were being developed, microwave, sound, things like that, and see the symptoms they generate, and then match symptoms to symptoms. And then, of course, at that point, then look for tech devices and things like that would detect those frequencies. And I know there's a number of publications on that. We're trying to put this all together in an orderly way so that you have a way of proving that these things are happening, and you can take it to court and sue the bastards.
I
That's the point.
Yes.
That has to be done.
Yeah,
I
we
haven't-
can't go do it back and forth. I'm sorry, because we're very limited in time. So what we're going to do, we can talk in the room. You can talk with them.
I thank you for your service to this country, and everybody that's going to see this video applauds you. We thank you for your work.
Great. What we'll do, what we're going to do now, it's 9:32, so I want to get summary remarks from the three speakers. Let me say one other thing quickly, just because this question that Ron got asked. I'm not going to go through a long thing here, but when you talk about the War of 1979, look at Brzezinski, Luke Zbigniew Brzezinski. You look at Bernard Lewis, who was the person, British intelligence agent who created what was called the Bernard Lewis Plan. The Islamic fundamentalist card is a derivative of that. That was Brzezinski's plan for attacking the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union, and that involved creating and fomenting Islamic jihad. And that's what Brzezinski famously did at the border of Afghanistan during 1979. Many things happened after that. That's an entire discussion that we can take up, but the point of the thing is that Islamic fundamentalism, as you know it, is something that was a combination project that was run by a combination of people, Bernard Lewis being the most important. He's still alive. He's down at Princeton. Brzezinski's policies were derivative from that. There are more things that can be said about it. And again, as I said, if people want to talk at the end, that's fine. Let me also just say this before everybody goes. There is an event tomorrow. You can find out about it. There's a memorial concert, which is in memoriam to the Alexandrov Ensemble. They were killed December 25th of last year on their way to Syria. This year we are commemorating, as we did last year, their deaths. And you can find out what we're doing specifically out at the front desk. For people who need more literature or more follow-up, of course, then you can go out to the front desk for that as well, and we'll talk about that. So what I'm going to do now is pass the microphone. Let me do it like this. I guess we'll do Ray first, Bill, and then Barbara. How about that? Do it like that? Great.
Now, I would just very briefly invoke the Noah principle. You know, we need to get out. We need to put our bodies into it. We need to, as this author said, figure out what instrument we hold and play it as well as we can. We're not required to do much more than to find our place in the score. What we love, we must protect. That's what love means. From the right to know and the duty to inquire flows the obligation to act. So please, not alone, find a good set of trusted friends and figure out what you might do together, or what you might do singly, but with the support of this small group of friends. As Margaret Mead said, this is the only thing that really can change the world. Good luck.
The point I would make is that we have to realize that we are the people who have the power. The power is in the people, not in the administration. If you don't like what they're doing and they're doing things that you find objectionable, fire them. Vote them out. Get rid of them. And if you find any kind of evidence that would allow you, sue the bastards. That's what I'm doing. I've got 3 separate lawsuits that I'm supporting against the United States government for violation of the constitutional rights of everybody. So one is in the 3rd Circuit, one is in the 2nd Circuit, and one's in the 11th Circuit, one in the 9th Circuit. The ACLU one fell apart, I guess, in the 2nd Circuit. But the others are going. And I've submitted sworn affidavits where I've been talking about all this material, saying exactly what it is and what it means. This is a sworn affidavit from me, which means I can be held for perjury. They don't want to hear me in these courts because it's not perjury. It's the truth, and they don't want to face it. So, but the ways to do this: stand up, embarrass your representatives, call them, bug them, do whatever you want. If they don't do what you want, vote them out. Get rid of them. I mean, after all, we have enough perpetually in place politicians in Washington. I like P words. So, but the point is, they're petrified down there. I mean, they're just sitting there, and they never move. Well, we need a little fresh blood, you know. So, at any rate, I would say do that, you know, And if you can't get them out that way, then sue them, or get them in court, some way, one way or the other, but embarrass them in any way you possibly can, and bug them. The squeaky wheel gets the oil. Be a squeaky wheel.
Okay, Barbara?
Those are fine sentiments. I have an echo. Let me just go like so. Those are fine sentiments from both gentlemen. What I would stress is that 2018 really is a year of decision for our country. People need to politically organize. The old saying, don't mourn, organize. That's really the point here. You can change the Congress in 2018, but you've got to have a perspective and a political program to do so. I happen to think that LaRouche's 4 laws for economic recovery is the best place to start. I also think that the United States joining the new Silk Road and joining the new paradigm is a huge optimistic vision for the country, which can have a real impact. And so I think, we've made since a year ago, if you really think about it, when this horrible assessment came out, this big lie was told and everybody was jumping up and down on it. We have made a substantial amount of progress this year. There are certain things moving in the Congress which are really quite shocking. Congress is beginning to stand up to the Department of Justice and the FBI. The question is, will they also stand up to the CIA and the NSA and to the whole kind of awful paradigm which has kept us crippled in this country for the last 20 years? And I think that's really the rallying cry which I draw from this particular discussion.
I want to say a couple things to people before you leave. There's a candidate in Texas by the name of Keisha Rogers who is running as an independent for Congress. She's well known because of her having won 2 Democratic Party primaries there, 2010 and 2012. And the reason she's running as an independent is because the need in this country now is for people who are independent to unify and to recognize that the Constitution of the United States is not partisan. This does not mean that you do not have partisan views and beliefs for which you strongly fight. Certainly, the LaRouche Political Action Committee is partisan, quite partisan, proudly partisan. But that is something that people have to look beyond in all of our cases to understand this. 50 years ago, we all, those of us who were here and those of us by dint of dissent, were witnesses to a process in our country that started 5 years earlier with the assassination of the president. And since that time, the presidency, apart from a few glimmers, has never been in the hands of the American people. The notion that we must be victims is only as true as our inaction makes it so. The importance is that when you have anybody, in this case Keisha, but in anybody who's actually standing up and is trying to rally people according to a concept of principle. And of course, we all know about Houston and the hurricane. We know about many things. The mayor of Houston has recently gone to China to try to see what he can do together with the Chinese to bring some relief to that city. So we're in a time where we need new ideas and a reversal of our own axioms. Isaac Rabin famously said back in 1994, I believe, 1 year before his assassination, in a toast that he gave with Yasser Arafat, "Here is to those who have the courage to change their axioms." The future is with those people, particularly in the United States. The future is with those who have the courage to change their axioms. And what tonight was about is giving the people of the United States the courage to change the axiom that, quote, they always win. They only win if you don't fight. So I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. That we're going to close out now. Thank you, and let's get to work.